why we are looking at a joint development agreement in the first place. So until the enforcement and enactment of the Real Estate Act, there was, like we all know, no real law governing real estate sector in India. Right. Now, for the first time, the authorities are making it mandatory under the Real Estate Act to submit the legal documentation to the authority regarding the properties. Right. So, I'll we've covered the sections, what relevant sections those are in the previous webinar. So I'll come to Rule 14 of the rules that have been notified recently in October, specifically talking of the Chandigarh rules, which applies to all union territories. And in that, there is Rule 14, subclause E, subclause 2, and capital subclause E. Now, here it says that at the time of registration, you have to provide a certain amount of legal documents. In those documents, there are various requirements of a title search report, a due diligence report. And then in clause E, it says that where the promoter is not the owner of the land. So a joint development agreement or a development agreement, the need for it arises when, say, Amartya, you have a piece of land. Let's say you have about 1 acre of land, and I intend to construct on it. And this becomes very important later at the stage of payment of stamp duty also. That if I'm not the owner of the land and I decide to construct on it, what rights will belong to you as the landowner and what rights will belong to me as the person constructing, because the land is yours, the money is mine, right? You are not putting in money and I don't have the land. So that is, I mean, contractually speaking, the consideration there is this reciprocity. So now clause E says that you have to give the details of the collaboration agreement, development agreement, joint development agreement, or any other agreement as the case may be, entered into between the promoter and the owner, and copies of title and other documents regarding the land proposed to be developed. So now, for the first time, there is a statutory requirement of having proper, well documented, well drafted joint development or development agreements. Until today, what had happened was that various states used to do various things. In, let's say, for example, South in Andhra Pradesh, you were allowed to execute what is called a development agreement cum GPA, which is a development agreement with a general power of attorney. And the stamp duty there was different. In some states like Maharashtra, where there was a Real Estate Act, you were not allowed to do that. Or you were allowed to do that with some modifications. Things like that. But there was no requirement of actually the intending buyer, which is the person who purchases a flat. He would never actually know what the development agreement says. As a purchaser or as a buyer, you would only execute what is called a builder-buyer agreement. Or like after your allotment letter, whatever agreement you sign with the builder. For the first time now, this becomes important that the consumers or the buyers will also know what the development agreement is. And the relevance of this specifically is that I can now independently verify the title of the property. And this becomes extremely important because, like we talked about in the last session we had, is that there are various amounts of frauds happening wherein the flats are built and then you realize that the land was never belonging to the owner in the first place. So not only is the developer or the builder in a problem, but you as a prospective purchaser are also in a problem. So that essentially is why we're talking about the joint development agreement. Now let's come to what it is, how it is structured, and what happens in a joint development agreement. The first and foremost in any contractual drafting is that the cause title which describes the description of the parties, right? So there will be a legal structure involved. You as an owner of the land might be an individual, you might be a partnership, you might be a company. But what is really important is that every single person who has a share in the property is made a party to the agreement. Now, what usually happens is that, like we have in a Hindu undivided family, the Karta does everything. Similarly, in an individual nuclear family, the father or the male person will usually do everything. So, what he does is that he just takes a power of attorney and gets it executed, right? He gets the agreement executed. My suggestion to you on a practical level to everybody who's listening is that it is best and always recommended that each person who has a share in the land is made a party to the agreement as opposed to or simply giving a power of attorney and letting one person execute it. Because it is always better and it is always safer when everybody is a party to the agreement. So that will decide your legal structure and thereby deciding whether it's through a power of attorney holder, through a director, or through a partner. That will determine the structure. Now, thereafter, it's very important to remember that in any agreement, and specifically an agreement regarding land, that you express very explicitly in the agreement that this agreement shall apply to the legal heirs, successors, executives, administrators, representatives of the parties also. Because what will happen is that you, as a father, might today sell the land to the developer, but your child might, and especially an Hindu um, child who has a right by birth in ancestral property, might say that I want my share, I don't want to give it to the developer, right? So you have to, in a lot of people, what happens is that during drafting, people tend to take the cause title very easy. The description of the parties section very easy. Just mention anything, just write their names and finish it off. But it has repercussions. It will determine whether your document is legally sound or not. Thereafter, you will come to what is called the recitals, the provision which starts with whereas. Now, I'll just share an interesting historical brief with you on why this whereas exists. So, I was taking a session with a couple of students in NLS Bangalore once, and it was posed as a question to me that why do you say whereas again and again? And can't we just make it simple and say whereas once and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And I said, yes, you can. Then the logical question was, then why don't we do it? And the answer to that is because that's the difference between an old school of contract drafting and a modern school of contract drafting. Now, what used to happen in England at the time was that you used to have one huge sheet of paper, and the entire agreement had to be written on that one sheet of paper alone. So, because people did not have space, they used to write whereas semicolon, whereas semicolon, whereas semicolon, only to show the distinction between two paragraphs in the recitals. And what used to happen is that that document had to be executed on two identical sheets of paper. And then the document would be clipped like this from the top. So you had to match both the copies to say that these are the originals. That was the reason why this practice of whereas started. Now we blindly follow it and start saying whereas. So what you can do now is just say whereas, put a colon, and write A, B, C, D. One bit of advice here is that do not use numbers, because numbers are actually used for clauses in the terms and conditions. So it's always better to use letters when you talk about recitals. Now, this seems more like a drafting class, but then I have to explain this, otherwise people will not get why it's supposed to be put in. In the recitals, you will talk about the chain of title. This comes from the title verification report that is done on the owner's land. So you will say that X purchased the property in 1990, Y purchased it in 2000, Z purchased it in 2016, and therefore Z is now the owner of the land. This is very important. It is extremely relevant to maintain a chain of title. Thereafter, you will talk about why the developer or the concerned builder is the best person to develop this land, because he has expertise and capital. And whatever the agreement between the parties, they are now putting it in this document. Then I'm not going to go into definitions and interpretation, but maybe some other time we can discuss this in detail. But please remember to have a very vast definition of applicable law and approvals or clearances, because this will determine what law will apply to your agreement. Right. So thereafter, let's move on and let's get to the point where you start talking about the terms and conditions and why each clause will become important. So your first essential clause will be what the project is about, right? Or in the alternative, your first clause can also be about the title of the property concerned. See, there are no rules in drafting. It's like one of my professors had once told me, it's a fresh canvas and the artist decides where he wants to start, as long as it looks pretty and as long as it conveys the message, right? So you can decide with title, you can start with consideration, you can start with the project, that's up to you. But what you really have to put down is that your title is not encumbered. And again, in the definition section, the definition of encumbrance should be very large, very vast, right? So you will talk about the title deed and the verification of the title deeds, that you have seen the title deeds and that there is a proper chain of title. Then a lot of times this clause is missed in the agreements, in joint development agreements, which says that the owners pledge not to sign an agreement with any other person during this agreement. Otherwise, what will happen is that the builder has started building, you will forfeit and you will give it to someone else. So basically the capital invested by the builder will go to waste. So you have to, it's like a non-compete, but you have to put it in that during the continuance of this agreement, the owner will not negotiate, not deal, not assign this agreement to anyone else, right? Then it matters what right you give to the builder. So for example, if I simply say that I allow the builder to enter my land and build on it, the logical analysis or the legal position that arises from there is that either you are a guest on my property or you are a licensee on my property. It is important that you use the word licensee. And the reason it is important is because then all the rights a licensee has will belong to the developer. This will become important when you have a dispute and say tomorrow you want to file for an injunction. The owner has told you that you cannot enter the land for any reason whatsoever, and your capital has already been invested. So what you have to do now is that seek an injunction allowing you to enter the land. In that case, if it is doubtful whether you're a licensee or not, you will have no such remedy in law, and your capital will go down the drain. Therefore, it is important that you decide what category the developer is. What I mean to say is, some people simply says, some agreements simply say that you have leave to enter the premises. A leave does not signify a license. A leave has a separate meaning altogether. It's like I invite you for dinner to my house. You have leave to enter my premises, but you're not a licensee. You are there only for 2 hours, not beyond that, right? Then it becomes important how one is going to share what the agreement is and how it will work. So this is typically the most negotiated clause in a joint development agreement. So now let me put down 2-3 scenarios of how this can work. One is that I will give you my land, you will build 10 apartments, 8 will belong to you, 2 will belong to me. End of the story. You can sell 8 as and when you like. Second scenario, I will make 10 apartments, 5 will belong to you, 5 will belong to me. I may sell 5 apartments, I may keep 5 apartments, I may lease 5 apartments. Totally up to me. You can do whatever you want with the remaining 5. Another example, that we will pay you a certain X amount of money, you will get no apartments, right? Why is this done? It is a very side kind of doing things, sideway, but it's done because you actually don't want to pay the stamp duty of first transferring the land in your name and then selling it to someone else. So in effect, you're getting the land and you're going to sell it, and you have paid the consideration to the owners in a totally different kind of a scenario. Then what matters is that in this sharing agreement, some people insist that there should be a security amount that the builder should pay the owners. Because what is happening is that as an owner, your land is getting blocked, right? You are giving possession of your land to the builder. His workers are going to be there. You have lost possession. And tomorrow, if the builder does not build in time, your land is gone, right? So some people typically insist on a very hefty amount of a security, that the builder should pay 25 lakhs or 10 lakhs to the owner, and on the payment of that security, the developer will come and start developing. Now, some people say that that security is refundable. Some people say that, security is by nature is refundable, but the conditions on which it is refundable are enumerated. So if there is a breach, if proper certificates are not taken, if proper approvals are not taken, if proper no objection certificates are not taken, then in that case, that security will stand forfeited. So these become important because this will determine ultimately who gets what as an owner and as a developer. Now, there is another curious clause which, let's say, some lawyers have started putting in recent times, and that's called a clause of forfeiture, which says that if in 2 years you don't develop my land and you don't finish the project, then this agreement will stand terminated and whatever you have done will stand forfeited. So if I've put in 35 lakhs and I've started building, that 35 lakhs stands forfeited. And now as an owner, I can deal with anyone else I feel like. So I can now assign it to a new developer. I can build it myself. Then in that scenario, it depends on what the agreement says, that if I have to engage another developer, you will indemnify me for all such losses. Because you have built, but it's 2 years have elapsed, my land is stuck, I have to engage someone else. Therefore, you compensate me for whatever loss I'm going to incur because of that. Now, when we talk about land, sorry, you were saying something.
What about the the flats that has been purchased by third parties? What about their rights? If the developer lives in between.
Correct. So I'll come back to that. There is a specific clause of third party liability.
Okay.
Right. I'll come back to that. Let me just wind up this portion on shares. Right.
Okay. Sure.
In the meantime, what has happened is that I've been talking to you about title and deeds and undivided and shares and what rights people have in the land. It is extremely important to note that any share in the land will always remain undivided. Because if it is divided, then the developer or the builder will only get the divided share.
Can you explain it a bit?
Yes, I'm going to explain that, Amartya. So say for example, I have ancestral property and there are 5 people in the family. My mother, my father, and 5 children. I am being one of them. And now all of us collectively want to give our 1 acre of land to the builder. Now the question is, all of us have 1/5 right in it, 4 children. And let's club the shares of the father and mother as 1 share, right? Now, in which portion is the builder going to build? And let's say apartment A comes in on the share which my mother holds. Apartment B comes in on the share which my brother holds. The staircase comes on the share which I hold. So people purchasing the flats, will they not get access to the staircase? Which is why these shares will always remain joint and they will always remain undivided. And that is why it has to be specifically said in the agreement that the common areas, the undemarcated and undivided area of land, and parking spaces will always remain undivided. There is something called as partition by metes and bounds, right? So logically following, there should be a clause in the agreement which says that the owners shall not file for a partition suit, and that the land will always remain undivided. Because what happens typically is that each flat owner has an undivided share in the land. So if you divide the shares, then you cannot grant an undivided share to the prospective purchaser, right? Then I'm not aware of if everybody understands why something is put in representations and warranties as opposed to a normal title verification. So the implication of putting something in a representation and warranty in a contract is that if you violate the representation and warranty, then the contract becomes void. Whereas if you breach the agreement, it remains voidable. So I'll not get into the distinction between the two, but that is relevant to understand. So basically, representations and warranties are like those most important and relevant things that if this goes wrong, we have no agreement.
So basically, it becomes a material breach.
Yes, it becomes a material breach. Now, in the material breach, it is very, I mean, I cannot emphasize enough why certain things should be put in representations and warranties. First of all, let's draw the distinction between a representation and a warranty. They don't mean the same thing. A representation is something in the past or something that is actually existing. So for example, if I pick up this pencil and I say that Albert Einstein wrote with this pencil, I am representing to a statement of fact, right? That this is Albert Einstein's pencil. But can I say Albert Einstein will write with this pencil? That's not possible anymore. So what I say as a representation is something that exists, like the floor is pure marble, correct? And warranty is something that will happen in the future. So I will warrant that I will take all licenses, I will take all approvals, or the parking will have automatic gates. That's something that I can warrant, right? Or that I will make a particular bed of teak wood. That is a warranty that I can give, correct? So now I'll just quickly run you through some of the representations and warranties which I think are relevant in a development agreement. One will again be of title, that the title is absolutely clean, that there is no encumbrance, there is no loan. Then nobody from your family or predecessor in title is going to claim this property, that it is absolutely yours. That you have all the rights to deal with it, which means you have not given power of attorneys to anybody else, you have not executed mortgage agreements with anyone else, there is no lessor or lessee, there's no lessee on the land, there is no licensee on the land. All these should come under representations which the owner should provide. Because if this is not true, then as a builder, how will you sell? And if you can't sell, then the project is a waste for you. It is just dead money. Similarly, a developer will warrant that I will take all approvals, I will maintain all licenses, I will get clearances from all authorities, that my company is duly existing and valid in law. You know what is happening, Amartya, these days? Sorry, just give me a second.
Yeah, sure.
Is that a lot of people have started registering LLPs, right? A lot of people have started registering LLPs, and they, for some mistaken belief, think that it is like a normal partnership. So what they do is that they behave as if it's just a partnership. There is no resolution, there are no minutes, there is nothing, and they proceed. Now what you will realize is that in or with the registrar of companies, only two people exist as partners of the LLP. And when the person executing the deed is a partner not even mentioned in the deed. So if something like that kind of a scenario happens, that the developer starts talking to you about executing an agreement which he has no power to execute, then what will you do as a landowner? So you need to take this warranty and representation from the developer that they are valid, they are duly organized, they are validly existing, and have sufficient authority to enter into this agreement. Right? This holds true for all agreements across the board, not just development agreements. Any person or any company or partnership that you deal with, you should always have a clause saying that you have the sufficient authority to deal with or enter into this agreement. Then, a lot of times what happens in joint development agreements is that you list out the quality of furniture and fittings that has to be used. This is usually marked as a separate schedule. Some people do it as an annexure. Now, I mean, I don't mean to sound picky, but there is actually a difference between a schedule and an annexure. And some people just tend to use it any which way they like. An annexure is not part of the main document. An annexure is a document which is concerned with this document. So for example, if I have got a sanctioned plan from the development authority, that can form part of the annexure. That will be an annexure to the agreement. But what I'm talking about in the agreement itself, for example, I'm saying I'm going to develop the project according to these specifications. Now, instead of listing those specifications in the main body of the agreement, I'm making them into a schedule. That is what a schedule is, right? So the difference then becomes that a schedule is actually a part of the main agreement. It's just that I don't want to mention the list there itself, so I'm mentioning it at the last page. Whereas an annexure is never part of the main agreement, it is just something concerned with the agreement, right? So whenever you use whenever you make a list or anything, even in a rent agreement, when you say that I'm leasing out 2 rooms, 3 rooms, 1 kitchen, things like that, always mention it as a schedule and never as a annexure, right? Then comes your rights about whether the developer can take money, can receive money, can give money, what all you can do. Then there's changes prior to the construction and after the construction. This is basically saying that the owner will pay all the rent, electricity charges, water charges till the time the construction starts, and thereafter it will become the liability of the developer. Now, while I'm mentioning this, I will now come to the point that you had raised, Amartya, about third parties, right? In this, 2 clauses will become relevant. One is an agreement, the builder-buyer agreement that you have with the investors and the purchasers. In this, you will exclude liability for each other's negotiation. So for example, if you're doing a 50-50 split, 10 apartments, 5 belong to you, 5 belong to me. Now, I will be liable only for my 5, you will be liable for your 5. So any money that you receive, I'm not liable for. Any money that I receive, you will not be liable for. This should come clearly in the agreement. Then I should clearly give rights about negotiating, reselling, leasing, and what rights I give here will then also come in a general power of attorney. So it is important that these rights are clearly spelled out in the agreement, because that is how the general power of attorney will also get rights. So
what is the general power of
attorney? This general power of attorney will be the power of attorney which the owners will give to the developer to sell the 5 shares, to sell the 5 flats.
Of owners share?
Yes. See, look, there are 10 apartments, right?
Okay.
The land belongs to the owners. Right. So who can sell? Only the owner can sell.
Right.
But I should get rights of 5 apartments. So that will come through a general power of attorney saying I have right over 5 flats and I can sell those 5 flats.
Okay, so the owner is giving it to the developer to sell his own shares.
Correct. Right? So the 5 flats that the developer will get after construction, to sell those flats. This power of attorney is also needed to get approvals from all the authorities. Because see, the owner is not doing the construction. So if certain security has to be paid to the development authority, if certain premium has to be paid, if certain license fees has to be paid, if some undertaking has to be taken, then obviously the developer is going to do that, right?
Yeah, and sometimes even that happens, like the owner says, like you sell my share also, like that will be a different agreement altogether, or generally it's put in the same agreement.
That is a different agreement altogether. See, if I am saying that the developer will have the right to sell my share also, then we go to the first scenario, Amartya, where I said I have 10 flats, 2 I'm going to keep, 8 belong to you. Once they belong to you, means you can deal with them. Or to the third scenario that I mentioned, wherein it says that you pay me a certain amount and then you do as you like with the property.
No, I'm
But that
telling of a
is-
situation where the ownership remains with me, the control, ultimate control remains with it, but I give them the marketing right or something like a agent, basically to broker kind of thing.
that won't really be a development agreement, Amartya.
That is not generally within the development agreement.
No, because a developer will never agree to that.
Okay.
You see, if I am putting in capital, why will I not make profit from it? Why will I only advertise for you? Then what will happen is that then you will draft a broker agreement or a commission agreement.
Okay.
Right? Because see, the reason the developer does this is because he intends to profit. And if there is no profit for him, he is never going to agree to this. So why will he make the flats for you and then only market it for you, but not sell it? Now, what? Imagine he builds 10 flats, right? And you want to take all the 10 flats for your family members, right? Market value of those flats is 35 lakhs. You agree on 20 lakhs. Somebody else's capital. You use the flats. He doesn't get to sell anything and he only gets to market it. It won't make sense for the developer, right? So that situation, I mean, unless it's there's some fraud involved somewhere, I don't think any developer in his right mind would agree to such something like that, right? So now in this third party thing, there is also one important thing that you will take insurance. The developer will take insurance to keep all workers and any property damage, for the indemnification of such things.
Okay.
Right? You would ask me a question, what about the intending purchasers? What about their rights if the owners don't have title or things like that? See, that is why the Real Estate Act is now asking for this document. Earlier, these situations have arisen and the intending purchasers have got nothing to do but except suing the builder. Right? Because they don't know who the owner of the land actually is. Now, this is why the Real Estate Act is asking you give us this document and publish it on your website so that the consumers or the intending purchasers can also verify title and also know who the actual owners are. Right? So this will become relevant there. Now, flowing from this aspect, you will realize something, that when a property is sold, you have to pay capital gains tax. Right? Now the question is, if there are 10 apartments and 5 will belong to you and 5 will belong to me, why should I pay capital gains on all 10? And if I should not pay on all 10, then why should you pay on all 10? We should pay capital gains only on our 5 apartments. Right? So there should be one clause which discusses this very clearly about the liability of capital gains. And it is very important to note that you should never mention in your agreement that possession of the property has been given to the developer, at least from the developer's side, because then the liability of capital gains will become of the developer. That is why I said use the word license, that he just has a right to come onto the property and leave the property. Possession has not been handed over. Because I'm not going to go into tax law, but broadly speaking, if you hand over possession, the capital gains liability will become yours. Become to the person who's taking possession. So as a developer, you should keep this very clear that the agreement does not say that you have taken possession. Right? Then, recently what happened is that there's a client of mine who, after spending 8 crores on a project, did not get approval from the bank.
Okay.
for the loan. And this happened because the document that was drafted by the owner's lawyer, my client was the developer, he did not put in a clause at all about loans. So the bank legal team said that you do not have any right to take a loan. The owners have not granted you that right. You don't have a right to do anything in the property except construct. Then we can't sanction the loan for you. Right? So this becomes extremely important, that you put in a clause which specifically allows the developer to take loans. But what you should be careful of as a landowner is that the loan will not be taken on the land itself. You can take a loan in connection with this project, but you can't mortgage my property. I have not given you that right. Correct? Similarly, as a developer, you need to ensure that the owner will not mortgage this property. What if you start developing? Then they give the title deeds of the property to the bank, and by deposit of title deeds, they create a mortgage on it. Then what will you do? So it should flow both ways. You are allowed to take loans, but neither party is allowed to take the loans on the land itself. Right? Because then your project will get encumbered for no good reason. Thereafter, there are certain rights the developer has, in the sense that the owners will execute all necessary documents, they will sign a power of attorney. And when we talk about a general power of attorney, it is extremely, extremely important to mention that that power of attorney will not be revoked till the time the development agreement is valid. A lot of times we simply put in a clause saying that the owner will grant a power of attorney. And what happens is that the owner grants a revocable power of attorney. Now imagine you put in all your capital investment and then the owner revokes the power of attorney. You can't sell the flats. Right? So you should very clearly and specifically mention that this attorney cannot be revoked till the time this agreement is valid and existing. Thereafter, there is something that owners association, right? So we all know these societies that are formed in the apartments or building, housing societies, which now look after the maintenance and things like that, and there are elections for president and secretary. So it is actually the responsibility of the developer to form this association and hand over the entire premises to this association, who is now going to maintain the project. So you should have a clause saying that the developer shall assist and ensure the formation of this association for the effective maintenance of the entire project, and that both parties will do what is necessary in order to ensure this. Then I'm going to talk to you about something which may or may not appeal to many people, but it depends on your terms of negotiation. You can even have a clause that subsequently you can, by mutual consent, and as an anecdote to drafting in general, whenever you use the word mutual consent, always use the word prior written mutual consent. Because what happens is, I can say written consent can even be subsequent, correct? Which means I do something, you and I orally agreed, I do something, then you say I did not give you consent, right? So always use the word prior and written. It can never be oral. Prior written mutual consent. If the parties by prior written mutual consent agree that we can agree later on certain additional clauses, they will form part of this agreement. This is done typically because sometimes there arises a scenario in which your agreement does not cover something. Let's say a bank loan or something else, and you want that to be part of the agreement, but now you've already paid a very heavy stamp duty, so you can't execute a fresh agreement. Right? So you would want to keep this option open for yourself. In this, you may add deleting also, but it's not advisable, because then it becomes open to dispute whether it should be deleted or not be deleted. It is always good to have addition but not deletion. Then indemnity. So you will ask for typically three things in an indemnity clause. A material breach of the agreement. B, a material breach of the representations and warranties. And C, any third party liability. Three in, and it should work for both parties. I mean, that's the most fair way of drafting this clause, right? That if either in these scenarios, if either party has messed up somewhere, then you will indemnify the other party for all losses. Right now, interestingly, the same very client who was the developer, he, after investing 8 crores, the demonetization happened. Right? Everybody understands that in the real estate sector, black money was the most trusted form of buying and selling. So his question to me was whether my force majeure clause covers a change in law, right? And unfortunately for him, the agreement that he had signed, which was drafted by the owner's lawyer, did not cover it. So he had a 2-year window to complete the project, and now due to demonetization, he did not have the money to do it. So in this force majeure clause, you should keep in some language which speaks about some drastic changes in law, just to be absolutely secure. It is advisable to have that political crisis or changes in law, drastic changes in law, or unreasonable hindrance. Then what happens is that you still have some sort of recourse, some sort of way to extend the agreement, right? Now, I will not go into arbitration and how an arbitration clause is to be made, but I will talk to you now about stamp duty. See, like I said, every state has different stamp duties. You will pay a stamp duty on the market value of the land, right? Now, whatever the percentage in the particular state, right? In Uttarakhand, at least I can tell you that it comes under Article 5, right, of the Indian Stamp Act. And that says that if you are not the owner of the land and the construction is going to be done by someone else, and then that is going to be held jointly by the owner and the developer. There, now you will understand, Amartya, why I said that the 5-5 or the 2-5 and the 8-5 will become important, of how you are going to split, because that will also determine your stamp duty implication, right? Now, if you're going to jointly hold it, then you have to pay market value as a normal conveyance under Article 23 of the Stamp Act, which basically means the percentage applicable. Like in Uttarakhand, it's 5%. So you will calculate the market value of the land and you will do a 5% of that market value, and that will be your stamp duty.
Mm-hmm.
In Telangana, or now Telangana, the stamp duty has been reduced to 0.5% in a development agreement. So you see how you structure your agreement can have a big implication for you. Like my client had recently paid a 32 lakh rupee stamp duty. If he was in Telangana, he would have had to pay barely like 3 or 4 lakhs. So how you structure your agreement, what clauses you mention will have an implication on your stamp duty. So you should always consult a lawyer before you sign off on a development agreement, right? And this works for both the developer and the owner, right? Then, now let's talk about that general power of attorney that you were talking about, Amartya. So like I told you, in Uttar Pradesh, the practice was that you would execute a development agreement come GPA, right? In that general power of attorney, you have the right to apply on behalf of the owners for all approvals, for all licenses. You have the right to sell, you have the right to negotiate, you have the right to do everything. But please remember that in the general power of attorney also, you need to mention that you have a right to sell the undivided share in land, the undemarcated share in land, the undemarcated common areas, the undemarcated parking spaces. Now, in all of this discussion, I have not mentioned roof rights to you. What about the terrace? Who will it belong to? Whether it will belong to the owner, or will it belong to the developer, or will it belong to the person or that flat which is either yours or mine? So typically, terrace rights should belong to everybody. They should also be 50-50 if your apartments are 50-50. But you can have a different kind of an agreement. Say, for example, you want to sell penthouses, which are the most expensive. So as an owner of the land, you keep all the penthouses and you allow the developer to sell the remaining. In that case, you would want to keep the terrace rights also, because like any penthouse owner would want the terrace also, right? So it is important that you mention and clarify these things in a joint development agreement.
And also the common spaces, right?
Yes, common spaces. See, common spaces by their nature will belong to everybody.
Okay.
Right? And the Real Estate Act gives a very explicit and long definition of common areas. It is in section 2, subclause N, N for New Zealand, right? And that gives a very exhaustive kind of a definition of common areas. So my suggestion to anybody drafting a development agreement would be to use this definition of common areas and make it an inclusive definition that shall mean or shall include, which means that if anything is left out, it will still come within common areas. Like if you have a super luxury apartment and you intend to have a helipad, right? You know, you and I can joke about it, but there are people who do execute those deals.
Yeah,
right?
Obviously.
And then the question is, who owns the helipad? Whether my helicopter can land on it or not, right? And that technically is a common area, right? Or it should be the terrace, or it should be the roof, right? So, you know, people can fight over different things. The more lucid, the more clear your agreement is, the less their disputes will be, right? In this, I would like to mention two very important things. One is a commencement certificate, and then there is a completion certificate and an occupancy certificate, right? Be sure to mention when and how the commencement certificate will come, when the construction can start. It can only start after a commencement certificate has been issued and a completion certificate has been received. Only then you can sell the flats. And then comes the occupancy certificate, which is that the building is now fit for habitation, right? Interestingly, the Real Estate Act also uses that same distinction. If you remember, Amartya, I told you that any current project in the country which has not received an occupancy certificate till date will also fall under the Real Estate Act. Right? So even though I may have completed my building and I may have a completion certificate, if I don't have an occupancy certificate, then I might be hit by the Real Estate Act and I might have to register within 3 months of the Act coming into force. So occupancy certificate, completion certificate and commencement certificate are extremely, extremely important in this to determine what, when and how the construction will start, when it will finish, when will you get the rights to sell the flat and in what proportion, and if you don't, then whether you default under the Real Estate Act, right? There are about 10 minutes left, Amartya. If there's anything you want to specifically discuss,
I have two, three different things that I have in mind. One is how, like, what is the owner's right, because this property still is in the name of the, the title is in the name of the owner itself, right? So he has to, like, what is the in terms of the third party who is buying the property, what is his rights, like, what is his duties to, like, transfer the
see, that's the important bit. For example, I will have a builder buyer agreement, right? So I can only transfer those flats which are going to belong to the builder. Right? I'm the builder. I'm going to get 5 flats. I can only enter into an agreement for those 5 flats.
Right.
Right?
Right.
In that, the owner has got to do nothing. The owner has no liability. The owner has no responsibility. Right? I spoke to you about that clause which says third-party liability. So this will cover that. But what about the agreements that the owner enters into with intending purchasers? In that case, it is only the owner's responsibility and it is not the responsibility of the developer. Right? So third party liability will be determined by what is mentioned in your agreement, which is why it is very important to make it absolutely clear when the owner will be liable and when the developer will be liable. Now assume a scenario, Amartya, that for some strange reason, the owner has become responsible for the liability of the builder. Right? Like you mentioned, some third party has sued the owner instead of the builder. And the court, for whatever reason, has held that the owner is supposed to pay. In that case, your indemnification clause will come in handy. Right? In that case, what will happen is that the owner will now sue the developer for all the loss that has happened because of that third party's claim. Which is why your indemnification should always have a provision for third party liability. Okay. So these two clauses will go hand in hand.
So the conveyancing part of the generally we execute a conveyancing deed basically, only transfer. So the developer has the right to execute that conveyancing deed.
Yes, that is what the general power of attorney will say.
Okay.
And because by virtue of that general power of attorney, now I as builder can transfer the flat to you because the owner has given me the authority. See, the owner has given me the authority to transfer the undivided share in land. And the construction was done by me, so I have the right to transfer the construction to you. Right? If we break it up into two, that is how it makes sense. So the construction I am transferring, the land the owner has given me the authority to transfer by virtue of the power of attorney. So now I can transfer both to you.
Okay. Another thing, we are discussing on a very important issue of the stamp duty. Okay.
Right.
If you can just maybe if you can clarify certain aspects, how you should draft basically, it was not very clear to me.
Okay.
If you can just discuss it a little bit.
Right. So see, once I told you that stamp duty is when possession is given and when possession is not given. Right? That will matter because whether you get hit by Article 5 or not. What happens in Article 5 of the Indian Stamp Act is that, let me just pull it out for you. I think it'll make more sense if I just quickly read it. See, Article 5 says, Clause B1 as amended in Uttarakhand I am reading. If relating to the sale of an immovable property where possession is not admitted to have been delivered, nor is agreed to be delivered without executing the conveyance. In this case, what will happen? Your stamp duty will become half.
Okay.
Where possession is not admitted.
Okay.
If possession is admitted, then you have to pay the full amount. Right. And if relating to construction of a building on a land by other than the owner, then you have to pay the full amount. So possession with respect to agreement to sell and possession with respect to development agreement, different stamp duties will apply. So sometimes what happens is that you execute an agreement to sell, you don't take possession of the land, and then you execute a general power of attorney. You don't enter into a development agreement at all. Or you enter into a development agreement, but you don't register the document. So you don't pay stamp duty. And you only pay stamp duty on the agreement to sell and the GPA. Right? This, what will happen is your stamp duty will become half. Right? For the purpose of calculation of stamp duty, there is a circle list, a circle rate list, which is issued by every state government for a certain area, which will tell you what is the value of land in that area. Right? This is what we in local terms calls the value in byte. So for example, for every let's say for example, something on the main road of Dehradun would cost you, I'm putting an arbitrary figure, 2000 rupees per square meter, right? So you will calculate the area in square meters. You will multiply it by 2000. That will be your market value or the value in white, right? And on that you will pay 5% stamp duty. So 5% of the market value is the actual stamp duty that you will be liable to pay. The value that you refer to in black is that 2000 into whatever 100 square meters. The black value will be 5000 into 100 square meters. So the value in white is actually the amount you disclose in your conveyance deed, which is your sale deed, and you pay stamp on it. The one in black is what is given as cash. So actually the property costs more, but you decide to show it lesser in your deed. That is the difference between white and black. And that's why the real estate sector has a lot of black money, right? So that is the aspect of stamp duty, Amadya.
Okay. Another one of our student has asked a question that is regarding development agreement in cooperative housing societies in Mumbai. So basically, his question is what are the precautions that he can take because the developers are fleecing the society members. So what kind of precautions can be taken regarding that?
See, first of all, if you already have a society, and it's an assumption on my part, you already have a building ready. If your question is that the builder did not agree to what, has not built the society in a manner that he should have, then you have a claim at present under the Consumer Forum for deficiency in service. Right? If your question is that as a society you are now entering into an agreement for development of a new project altogether, right? Then you should have rights in your development agreement. Again, indemnification, clearly listing out in the schedule the quality of work to be done, the quality and brands of the furniture and fittings to be used, right? The quality of material to be used. For example, a lot of times in the schedule, people mention that you will use X brand of cement, that the ratio of cement to water will be such and such, things like that, or that the project or there will be a supervisor present at all times when the material is being utilized. And a chief engineer or a civil engineer will certify that the construction meets Schedule A of the agreement. So then in that case, you can prevent, or you can also take a security from the developer, like I mentioned in the beginning. So if he decides to fleece you, you can keep the security. So it has a deterrent kind of an effect on the developer not to cheat or not to play foul with the people.
Right. Yeah. I don't think so. We have come to the end of the discussion. Do you think anything that is left out for the whole part?
No, Amartya, I think I've more or less covered everything in brief, because if we, each aspect can be dealt with at quite a bit of length. So there are various aspects in all clauses which I can give you a scenario A and a scenario B, but that would become more or less of a contract kind of drafting class. I've tried to give a highlight of all the main issues that happen with respect to property and the development agreement.
Yeah.
And now the relevance I've already explained, that under the Real Estate Act, you have to have a good agreement. Otherwise, the authorities can even refuse your registration.